Imagine, for a moment, a ballroom glittering under the soft haze of gaslight, the chandeliers drip with crystal, the air heavy with perfume and expectation. On one side of the Atlantic, fortunes made from steel, railroads, and oil have created a new class of American aristocracy, families whose names are whispered with awe, though only recently written into history. On the other side, in Europe, there stand the ancient houses of nobility, proud, elegant, and often desperately short of cash, but still cloaked in centuries of prestige. It was in the meeting of these two worlds that something curious was born, a bargain, a transaction dressed as romance, where a daughter raised in the drawing rooms of New York or Newport could step into a carriage in London, Paris, or Vienna, and emerge not merely as a bride, but as a duchess, a countess, even a princess. She carried across the ocean not just her gowns and her jewels, but the weight of her father's fortune, fortunes that were as vast as they were new. And yet, beneath the glitter of the banquets and the rustle of silk gowns, love was often little more than a polite afterthought. Marriage became a chessboard, and daughters the most valuable pieces. For families in Europe clinging to their coats of arms, but struggling to maintain their castles, a wealthy American bride was salvation. And for ambitious families in America, eager for respectability and centuries-old title, a European groom was the golden ticket. This was the age of the so-called dollar princesses, a chapter in history that unfurled during the height of America's Gilded Age, from the booming decades of the 1870s through to the shadowed doorstep of the First World War. It was an era when marriage was less about love and far more about contracts, where champagne flowed as freely as negotiations, and where the promise of a coronet could be bought at the price of a dowry. They were the daughters of tycoons who had built railroads, mined silver, refined oil, or simply speculated with uncanny luck. Their families had mansions lined with gold leaf wallpaper, banquets where oysters were served by the hundreds, and diamonds so large they looked faintly absurd pinned to the bodice of a ball gown. And yet, in the rigid society of New York, Newport, and Boston, that kind of money still wasn't enough. Old American families with names like Astor and Livingston turned up their noses at these new fortunes, refusing to mingle at the highest social tier. So, if doors in America remained closed, the solution was to cross the Atlantic. In England, France, and Italy, noble families with exquisite titles but collapsing bank accounts were quietly desperate. Their ancient estates were crumbling, their hunting lodges had leaky roofs, their servants were unpaid, and their ancestral portraits stared down reproachfully from damp walls. But a title, an earl, a duke, even a prince, could still dazzle across an ocean. And to an ambitious American family, the transaction was simple: cash in exchange for coronets. And so, the marriages began, glittering unions of wealth and rank, photographed for newspapers and whispered about in drawing rooms. To society, it looked like romance. To the families involved, it was more like high-stakes currency exchange. The stage for this strange marriage market was set on both sides of the Atlantic. In America, the late 19th century was a fever dream of money. Railroads stitched the continent together. Oil gushed from Pennsylvania wells. Steel mills glowed like furnaces of fortune, and the men who controlled them rose to a level of wealth that even kings might have envied. Cornelius Vanderbilt, Andrew Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller, their names became shorthand for money itself. They built marble mansions that looked more like Renaissance palaces, hosted dinners where the champagne never stopped flowing, and collected art in a way that made European museums quietly grind their teeth with envy. And yet, all the gold in the world could not buy one thing: social legitimacy. For in New York, Newport, and Boston, there existed an invisible wall, one built not of brick, but of ancestry. Old families, who traced their lineage to Puritan founders or colonial governors, looked down with icy disdain on these newcomers, A fortune made in railroads or oil wells was, to their eyes, vulgar compared to wealth quietly resting in stocks and old landhold. A daughter of a railroad baron might wear diamonds the size of walnuts, but if her grandmother had once run a boarding house instead of a salon, she would never be admitted into the right ballroom on Fifth Avenue. Money, it turned out, could open many doors, but not all. Meanwhile, in Europe, the aristocracy sat in their ancient halls surrounded by ghosts of better days. Their names carried centuries of weight: dukes, earls, princes, counts, titles that glittered in gilt frames and family crests. But the fortunes that once supported them were leaking away like water through cracked stone. Agricultural prices had plunged. The industrial age had shifted wealth toward factories and banks, and the sprawling country estates that once symbolized their dominance had become financial sinkholes. Roofs leaked, tenants left, and creditors sent letters edged in polite threats. Many noble families were land-rich but perilously cash-poor, guardians of history who could barely afford to keep the fires lit. And so, the great transatlantic equation was born. On one side, Americans with vaults of money but no pedigree. On the other, Europeans with impeccable pedigree but empty vaults. The solution, as society saw it, was obvious. A daughter with a dowry worth millions could trade it for a coronet. A son with a title could exchange his faltering estate for a bank account that stretched from New York to Chicago. What followed was less a romantic whirlwind and more a series of carefully staged transactions, disguised with lace and pearls. Families crossed oceans with marriage contracts, tucked discreetly between gowns. Young women were paraded through London's glittering season, a blur of balls, banquets, teas, and horse races, their mothers hovering like generals on a battlefield. And when a match was finally struck, newspapers on both continents seized on the story. They printed photographs of the brides, described their gowns in exquisite detail, and turned private arrangements into public spectacle. To understand why these marriages blossomed, we need to look at the curious world of the late 19th century. On one side of the ocean, America was awash with new fortunes. Railroads stitched the country together. Steel turned skylines into forests of iron, and oil gushed wealth from the ground. Families like the Vanderbilts, Astors, and Goulds became household names, and in the span of a single lifetime, they rose from ordinary beginnings to fortunes so vast that no one could quite calculate. But there was a problem. In the old money social circles of New York and Boston, money alone wasn't enough. You could buy a mansion on Fifth Avenue, fill it with marble imported from Italy and crystal chandeliers from France, but still find your name omitted from the guest list of the 400, the elite families considered the true high society. In America, money brought power, but it didn't always bring the respectability that these newly wealthy families so desperately craved. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the picture looked very different. Europe's aristocracy had titles, history, and endless ceremony, but many of them no longer had the money to maintain it. Castles were crumbling, estates were heavily mortgaged, and centuries of inherited wealth had been eaten away by wars, debts, and the rising costs of keeping up appearance. Some dukes and counts were little more than landlords clinging to their titles while living in drafty halls with more servants than income. So the arrangement was, in its way, obvious. American fortunes could buy what money could not: prestige, ancient lineage, and a seat at tables where emperors dined. And European nobles, in turn, could trade their names and their centuries-old coats of arms for a marriage that came with a dowry measured not in modest estates, but in millions. It was a perfect storm of need and opportunity. In a sense, it was capitalism and feudalism shaking hands. The daughters of America's tycoons became the currency of social mobility, and the heirs of Europe's aristocracy became the brokers of title. Both sides pretended it was romance. Both sides knew it was business. For the young women at the center of this transatlantic bargain, the journey was more than a social arrangement. It was a leap into the unknown. Imagine being 18 or 19 years old, dressed in silks, chosen by your mother, waved off by your family and society friends, and stepping aboard an ocean liner bound for Europe. You had been raised in the glittering world of Fifth Avenue balls and Newport mansions. But the future ahead of you was less a fairy tale and more a contract. The voyage itself was a performance of wealth. Families booked entire suites on the most luxurious ships of the day, where even the first-class dining room seemed determined to outshine Versailles. White-gloved stewards served 7-course meals, orchestras played while the Atlantic rolled beneath the hull, and ladies in Parisian gowns promenaded on deck. But behind the elegance was the quiet knowledge that when the ship docked in Southampton or Cherbourg, life would change forever. Some girls confessed in their journals that they wept as the New York skyline disappeared behind. Others wrote of excitement, of a sense of destiny, of believing they were entering into history. Most, though, seemed to carry a sense of resignation. They knew they were not only daughters, but investments. Their worth was calculated not by their wit or their laughter, but by the size of their dowry and the luster of their family fortune. It is worth remembering that these marriages were not small steps. They were more than changing houses or neighborhoods. They were transplants, new languages, new customs, and often a cold welcome into aristocratic families who looked at their American daughters-in-law as useful intrusions rather than beloved relatives. Crossing the Atlantic meant saying goodbye not only to the land of your birth, but to the possibility of ever coming back as the same person. At the heart of the phenomenon was a simple exchange, though wrapped in silks and ceremony. American money for European title. The negotiations could be as tense as any business deal. Fathers sat across tables from impoverished dukes, lawyers drew up contracts, and vast sums were discussed in hushed tones while daughters waited in adjoining rooms. In many cases, the dowries were enormous. Fortunes of $2, $3, even $10 million were transferred, the kind of wealth that could restore a castle roof, restock wine cellars, or pay off gambling debts that stretched across decades. For the American families, the bargain was clear. A daughter's marriage to a titled European did more than elevate her own position. It elevated the entire family. Suddenly, a name once sneered at as new money in New York could boast of being connected to the Dukes of Marlborough or the Princes of France. The family tree itself was rewritten, grafting American fortunes onto centuries-old aristocratic branches. For the European nobles, the transaction was no less transparent. They offered what remained of their heritage, crests, traditions, and entry into the highest circles of European life. They knew their daughters and sisters could not command the same dowries, nor could their crumbling estates compete with the opulence of Fifth Avenue. In many cases, marrying an American heiress was the only way to preserve their line, to keep the title alive and the estate from being sold to creditors. And so the bargain was struck again and again. In the press, it was dressed up as romance, beautiful American girls conquering Europe with their charm. But in private correspondence, the language was colder, sharper, and far more honest. One British peer famously remarked that he had married not a woman, but a railroad. Another called his bride's father the golden goose. Yet still, the marriages went forward, and newspapers lapped up every detail, turning them into the celebrity weddings of their day. And then, the dream collided with stone, quite literally. Because if you thought those ivy-covered castles looked romantic from the outside, try living in one. They were drafty, echoing places with more rats than chandeliers. American girls raised with hot water, central heating, and chefs on call found themselves in mansions, where the only warm room was the one with a fire going, and even that smelled more like singed wool and damp stone than comfort. Imagine walking down a hallway lined with ancestral portraits, every stern ancestor staring down at you as though whispering, "We tolerated gout, we tolerated revolutions, and now we must tolerate you." These young women, dressed in Worth gowns from Paris, found themselves slipping on uneven flagstones and wondering why no one had thought to invent rugs. It was the 19th century's version of moving into a fixer-upper, except the fixer-upper had been built in the 1400s and came with ghosts, unpaid servants, and roofs that leaked like a politician's promises. And yet, duty was expected. The new duchess or countess was required to host dinners in cavernous dining halls where her voice echoed like a bad microphone at a karaoke bar. She was expected to know the difference between 3 forks, speak flawless French at the table, and pretend she didn't notice when her new relatives whispered about her vulgar American accent. Think of it as joining the most toxic in-law group chat imaginable, except you can't mute it, and you definitely can't leave. The truth was, life inside the castle walls was not a fairy tale. It was more like signing up for a job you couldn't quit, in a building that hadn't been properly insulated since the Wars of the Roses. If America in the Gilded Age was loud, brash, and new, Europe was old, brittle, and very sure of itself. The result was what you might politely call a cultural clash. Imagine a Silicon Valley tech founder marrying into an English aristocratic family today. One side brings confidence and unlimited funds. The other side brings centuries of passive-aggressive table manners and unshakable superiority. That's essentially what happened, only with more diamonds and fewer electric cars. American heiresses arrived with trunks of gowns, boxes of jewelry, and the energy of women raised in a culture where money was meant to be spent. Their new in-laws, meanwhile, were appalled that anyone would wear such bright colors, or worse, talk about money in public. To an American, money was proof of success. To an English duke, it was vulgar to even admit you had it, which was particularly ironic, given that most of them had none. Dinners could feel like theatre, with every word scrutinized. An heiress who mentioned the stock market might as well have declared herself a circus performer. A comment about business could freeze a dining hall faster than a January draft. But to the Americans, the old world rules of silence and deference seemed suffocating. Letters home often dripped with a mix of amusement and despair. The duchesses of the dollar knew they were both admired and mocked, tolerated and resented. And yet in this clash, there was also a strange fascination. The Americans secretly longed for the dignity and history of European title. The Europeans, however, begrudgingly, couldn't help but envy the energy and freedom of the Americans. Together, they formed uneasy unions, part romance, part theatre, part financial rescue mission. In the end, the marriages were not fairy tales, but more like reality TV. Glamorous on the surface, full of conflict underneath, and impossible for the public to stop watching. It would be lovely to imagine that these marriages ended with storybook happiness. The American girl in satin gowns strolling through rose gardens with her brooding duke, living out a real-life Bridgerton episode. But the truth is, most of them were closer to a slow-motion train wreck, only with tiaras involved. Take Consuelo Vanderbilt, the poster child for misery and pearls. Her mother, Alva, practically staged her wedding like a corporate merger. Consuelo was locked in her bedroom until she signed off on marrying the Duke of Marlborough, a man who seemed to consider charm an optional extra, like leather seats in a car. On her wedding day, Consuelo reportedly wept so hard, her eyes were red under her veil. Guests must have wondered if the bride was simply moved by the solemnity of the vows. But no, she was just realizing she'd been sold for about 2.5 million in railroad shares. It's the historical equivalent of being strong-armed into a marriage because your mum promised you a lifetime subscription to Netflix if you went through with it. The Duke himself was about as warm as a drafty corridor. Within a few years, he had mistresses. Consuelo, meanwhile, threw herself into philanthropy and eventually escaped with her dignity intact, divorcing him in 1921. But the story stuck. Behind the diamonds and the palaces, there were often very human tears, and Consuelo wasn't alone. Another American heiress, Mary Leiter from Chicago, married George Curzon, future Viceroy of India. Sounds glamorous, right? Except George treated his wife with all the tenderness of a brick wall. He managed to be both controlling and unfaithful, which is truly a multitasking skill. Mary spent her married life smiling politely at banquets, while likely plotting revenge through eyebrow raises. If Instagram had existed back then, her feed would have been nothing but heavily filtered palace corridors and captions like, "Another day, another gala." Then there were the money disasters. Some families took the dowry, burned through it like teenagers with their first credit card, and left their wives holding the emotional receipts. American fortunes patched the roofs of castles, kept servants paid, and restocked wine cellars, but often the brides themselves were left cold and isolated. Imagine throwing away millions of dollars and getting, in return, a husband who spends more time with his hunting dogs than with you. The press loved every ounce of drama. Newspapers on both sides of the Atlantic reported these failures with glee, proving that celebrity gossip didn't begin with the Kardashians. It began with society pages relishing the breakdown of the Marlboroughs' marriage. Readers devoured every detail. Because, honestly, who doesn't love a story where the rich and glamorous turn out to be just as miserable as the rest of them? Of course, not every dollar princess ended up locked in a loveless union. Some were clever, resourceful, or just plain lucky enough to spin their gilded cages into something resembling freedom, or at least relevant. Jenny Jerome is the crown jewel of these success stories. An American socialite who married Lord Randolph Churchill, Jenny didn't just step into the British aristocracy, she set it on fire. She was glamorous, witty, and far too clever to play the silent, decorative role. Think of her as the 19th century version of an influencer who knows how to work the algorithm. She hosted salons, influenced politics, and became a fixture in London high society. When Lord Randolph flamed out, Jenny's reputation only grew. And as if to underline her impact, she gave birth to Winston Churchill, one of the most influential figures of the 20th century. Not bad for a Brooklyn girl with a knack for conversation. There were others who carved their niches too. Some heiresses weren't just arm candy for decaying dukes, they were lifelines. Their money kept entire estates from collapsing. Without them, many of the stately homes of England would have been repossessed faster than a subprime mortgage in 2008. These women weren't simply buying status, they were subsidizing a national heritage project, one silk gown at a time. And while many marriages were loveless, some couples managed an understanding. A husband might keep a mistress. A wife might find comfort in charitable work or discreet friendships. And together, they maintained the appearance of success. It wasn't romance, but it was survival. And sometimes survival dressed in diamonds is enough. Of course, success is a relative term. For every Jenny Jerome, there were dozens of women smiling stiffly at banquets while quietly suffocating inside. Others turned their attention to philanthropy, fashion, or even politics, finding ways to matter in societies that treated them as trophies. In today's terms, they were the ones who turned unhappy marriages into personal brand empires. In the end, the dollar princesses who succeeded weren't necessarily the happiest, just the ones who played the long game better than their husband. They left behind reputations, legacies, and sometimes even children who reshaped history. They proved that while money might not buy happiness, it could buy influence. And in the aristocratic jungle, influence was the only currency that mattered. For every dollar princess who secured her duchess's coronet and settled into a life of drafty castles, there was another whose story ended in disappointment, disillusionment, or divorce. The transatlantic marriages were, after all, not fairy tale, but contract. And like any contract, they could fray under the weight of mismatched expectations. Some American brides arrived in Europe believing they were stepping into a Jane Austen novel, all rolling lawns and witty conversations at candlelit dinners. Instead, they often discovered that their new estates were more akin to underfunded museums, grand facades masking leaky roofs, entire wings too expensive to heat, and family silver pawned discreetly every winter. If they thought they were marrying charm, wit, or even companionship, They sometimes found themselves shackled to husbands who were more interested in hunting, mistresses, or maintaining the family's centuries-old wine cellar than in building any kind of marital intimacy. Of course, divorce in the late 19th century wasn't quite as simple as signing a few papers and splitting the property. It was scandalous, nearly unthinkable in the highest ranks of society. Yet several of these matches did collapse, usually after years of bitterness, tabloid speculation, and whispered family dinners where no one made eye contact. The newspapers of both continents reported gleefully on these implosions, because nothing sells quite like the spectacle of an heiress who paid millions to marry a title, only to find that the title wasn't worth the paper it was printed on. Still, not every match soured. There were those rare unions where affection blossomed unexpectedly, where the American heiress's energy and pragmatism paired surprisingly well with a titled husband who appreciated her confidence and capital. A few even became celebrated couples in their own right, remembered not just for the dowry that brokered their match, but for the partnership that grew out of it. But these stories were exceptions, shining needles in a haystack of marriages held together more by bank ledgers than by affection. And here's where the modern metaphor practically writes itself. Imagine online dating today, swiping right on someone because their profile lists financially stable in bold letters, only to discover 6 months in that stable really means living in a family house with plumbing issues, no heat, and a mother-in-law who expects weekly attendance at Sunday dinner. That was the plight of many of these heiresses, drawn in by the gleaming coat of arms, only to realize they'd essentially bought into an aristocratic timeshare with endless maintenance fees. For every Cinderella, there were a dozen who found out that the glass slipper pinched, and once you're stuck in it, there's no returning it for store credit. When the guns of 1914 thundered across Europe, the era of the dollar princesses came to an abrupt and rather undignified end. Suddenly, dowries couldn't stop bullets, castles were turned into hospitals, and the grand ballrooms where Americans once twirled under chandeliers echoed instead with the footsteps of nurses and soldiers. The transatlantic marriage market collapsed almost overnight, and with it went the strange social alchemy that had paired Midwestern fortunes with English baronies. But the legacy of these women lingered. Some stayed in their adopted countries for life, adapting to the peculiar rhythms of aristocratic duty with varying degrees of success. Others fled back to America, scarred by scandal or simply exhausted by the effort of keeping a crumbling estate afloat. And a select few made history not just for their bank accounts, but for the influence they wielded, bringing new money, yes, but also new ideas, new energy, and a distinctly American refusal to be silenced. It is tempting to look back and smirk, to see them as naive social climbers, or as spoilt daughters buying themselves tiaras the way one might buy a designer handbag today. But that would be unfair. These marriages tell us more about the age than about the women themselves. In a society where women's choices were limited, marrying into a title could be seen as both a cage and a form of power, a chance to reshape destiny, however flawed the outcome might be. And perhaps the most enduring legacy is cultural, not personal. The dollar princesses stitched together a symbolic bridge across the Atlantic, America lending its wealth, Europe lending its lineage. Out of that uneasy alliance grew a shared fascination, one that still persists in our endless appetite for royal weddings, aristocratic scandals, and the ongoing fantasy that somewhere, somehow, money and title might still find their way into each other's arms. In the end, the dollar princesses remind us of a truth that feels oddly modern, that wealth and status make dazzling promises but can't guarantee happiness, that marriage is never just about two people, but about the families, societies, and economies that circle. It was as true in the gilded salons of 1890 as it is on today's dating app. Only the costumes have changed. Got it. Thank you for catching that. Right now, segment 10B reads more like a tight outline. To bring your script to full length, we'll need to slow the pacing, expand each life story with detail, and add additional princesses beyond the three I drafted: Consuelo Vanderbilt, Mary Leiter, Clara Ward. The phenomenon of dollar princesses didn't stop at a handful of society's brightest names. It was practically an industry, with a long line of eligible young women exported overseas, as if the United States were running a luxury goods trade in heiresses. If you imagine today's reality TV lineup of most eligible singles, only with tiaras instead of TikTok dances, you'll get the picture. Take Consuelo Vanderbilt, often crowned the ultimate dollar princess. At 18, she was maneuvered into marriage with the Duke of Marlborough, who was essentially running low on funds but quite rich in family name and real estate. Blenheim Palace, his ancestral home, wasn't just a house. It was the kind of residence that makes modern mega mansions look like suburban starter kits. Consuelo, who had once dreamed of a freer, more romantic life, became trapped in a palace where cold stone walls and colder dinners with her husband left her deeply unhappy. Her mother, Alva, had orchestrated the entire union with the precision of a corporate merger. For years, Consuelo endured her gilded cage until she finally separated from the Duke, later finding love on her own terms. In the tabloids, she was both a cautionary tale and a symbol of resilience, a reminder that even the grandest wedding doesn't guarantee happiness. Then there was Mary Leiter, who married Lord Curzon and ascended to the dazzling but grueling role of Viceroy of India. Picture being a young woman from Chicago, suddenly responsible for hosting imperial ceremonies on a scale so large they made modern celebrity weddings look intimate. She was draped in jewels, paraded in finery, and expected to embody the majesty of the British Empire. Yet behind the spectacle, her health faltered, and the strain was relentless. If Instagram had existed in her day, her feed would have been a perfect illusion. Elephants, palaces, glittering jewels. The captions might have been quietly desperate, still smiling, send help. Her story was one of both triumph and tragedy, a Midwestern girl transformed into a global symbol and then consumed by the weight of that symbolism. Clara Ward, by contrast, took a very different path. The daughter of a Detroit industrialist, she married a Belgian prince, but the stiff etiquette of European courts bored her quickly. Instead of playing the dutiful noblewoman, Clara ran off with a Hungarian violinist and embarked on a scandalous new life. She performed on stage in costumes that left little to the imagination, scandalizing polite society, but thrilling audiences. If Consuelo Vanderbilt was the tragic heroine, and Mary Leiter the weary empress, Clara was the runaway train, unapologetic, messy, and unforgettable. In another era, she would have had her own reality show. And then came Jenny Jerome, though slightly earlier than the Gilded Age rush. She married Lord Randolph Churchill and became the mother of Winston Churchill. Born in Brooklyn, with impeccable social ambition, Jenny was the prototype dollar princess, witty, stylish, and adept at navigating British society. Her marriage wasn't exactly smooth sailing, but her influence on politics and culture was undeniable. She wasn't just decorative, she was a force. In today's world, Jenny would have been the kind of woman who runs her husband's campaign, redesigns the party logo, and launches her own podcast all at once. Another remarkable figure was Pauline Astor, who married into British nobility and carried with her the weight of the Astor fortune. The Astors were practically royalty in New York, but Europe still regarded them as nouveau riches. Pauline's dowry ensured her entry into British aristocracy, though her own life played out quietly in the shadows of more flamboyant contemporaries. She was less of a headline grabber, more of a stabilizer, the equivalent of the heiress who doesn't trend on Twitter, but keeps the family brand alive through careful discretion. Maud Burke, another wealthy American, married into French nobility and became the Princesse de Polignac. But unlike some of her peers who suffered in silence, Maud thrived in Parisian high society, supporting the arts and becoming a patron of music. While others struggled under the weight of their titles, Maud embraced hers, Becoming a central figure in salons and artistic circles, she proved that not all dollar princesses were trapped. Some found genuine purpose, though perhaps it's easier to find meaning when you're already surrounded by Cézannes and Chopins. And we cannot leave out Anna Gould, the daughter of railroad magnate Jay Gould. She married into the French aristocracy twice, first to Count Bonny de Castellane, and later to the Duc de Talleyrand-Périgord. Both unions were drenched in drama, scandal, and tabloid frenzy. Her first marriage ended in a bitter, very public divorce that became something of a soap opera for readers on both sides of the Atlantic. Her second marriage fared little better. Anna's story reads like a cautionary tale about the dangers of mixing Wall Street fortunes with old-world vanity titles. If her life were adapted today, it wouldn't be a fairy tale. It'd be prestige TV. Each of these women demonstrates the spectrum of outcome. Some became global icons of duty and grandeur. Others became walking scandals, and a few managed to quietly reinvent themselves in roles that suited them better than duchess or princess. But all were bound by the same economic and social transaction. Their fathers' fortunes traded for their husbands' pedigrees. It was a system where daughters became currency, and the exchange rate was determined by the size of the dowry and the fragility of a European noble family's finances. If you squint, you can even see echoes of this system in the modern obsession with celebrity marriages. Think of the way tabloids still frame weddings between Hollywood stars and royalty, or billionaires and models. The spectacle hasn't disappeared, it's just rebranded. The dollar princesses were, in a sense, the influences of their age, their lives scrutinized, judged, and mythologized by a world eager to believe that beauty and money could buy happiness, even when the evidence suggested otherwise. For every triumphant headline about a glittering wedding, there were quieter stories that rarely made it into the society pages. Behind the pearls and champagne, many of these marriages were brutally transactional. Some women lived out their days in drafty castles, where the walls leaked as badly as their husband's fidelity. Others found themselves trapped in loveless unions, bound not just by vows, but by entire nations' expectations. Think of it like buying a beautiful mansion on Zillow today, only to realize the roof is collapsing, the plumbing is Victorian in all the worst ways, and the previous owner, your new husband, refuses to fix anything because it's tradition. The glamour of the lifestyle often faded quickly, replaced by loneliness, duty, and a sense that one's own wealth had been spent buying into someone else's decline. The price of a tiara, then, was not measured only in dollars. It was measured in identity, freedom, and sometimes sanity. These women had secured titles for their families, but in the process, they often found their own voices slipping into silence, drowned out by the echo of ancestral expectations. If all of this feels strangely familiar, it should. The phenomenon of the dollar princesses is less about powdered wigs and aristocratic estates than about a very human truth. Societies always find ways to package women as currency. Yesterday it was baronies and dowries. Today it might be reality shows, Instagram sponsorships, or a billionaire's yacht. The stage changes, but the performance remains hauntingly similar. We are still fascinated by the idea of marrying up, of ordinary women entering gilded worlds, whether through Buckingham Palace weddings or celebrity unions splashed across tabloids, and we are still unsettled by what those stories reveal about wealth, power, and the narrow roles carved out for women. The dollar princesses may feel like figures out of a faded photograph, but in reality, they were early players in a drama that is still being written. They were both victims of a system and subtle rebels within it. Women who leveraged what they had in a world that gave them few choices, even if it meant exchanging the familiar comforts of home for cold stone corridors across the sea. In that way, their story is timeless. It is not just history, it is a mirror. And so, the age of the dollar princesses faded, quietly, almost as though it had been a fever dream. The First World War rewrote the rules of power. Monarchies fell, fortunes vanished overnight, and the transatlantic marriages that once seemed so glittering suddenly looked like relics of a world already gone. The women themselves, those young American heiresses, carried on as wives, as mothers, sometimes as widows too soon. Some were remembered in biographies, others in whispers, but many simply folded into European aristocracy until their voices and fortunes became indistinguishable from the families they once rescued. And perhaps that is the final irony. Their lives were meant to be dazzling showcases of wealth and status, splashed across newspapers, their weddings described in breathless detail. Yet, in the end, most of them slipped into history with little more than a line in a family tree. The castles they bought crumbled, the gowns grew yellow with age, and the fortunes were scattered. But for a brief moment, one strange, glittering generation, American money and European titles collided, and the result was part romance, part transaction, and part, well, let's just call it international real estate. If you're listening in bed with tired eyes and an overthinking brain, you're in the right place. Let this story carry you. And if you're still awake at the end, I'll be here to say goodnight.